I am alive, and I would say I'm doing well, but it's okay. So since we've talked, what did we talk before we had our third kid? I don't remember, Mike. Too many things have been going on lately.
I think that we talked, but it was kind of in passing. I don't think we've recorded anything maybe since you had your baby. Did we?
Okay, well, all right. So we have our third baby in the house now. Third kid, little girl, Hazel. Hi, Hazel. And she's been a really good kid so far. She's 3 weeks old now. And I would say she's sleeping well at night. She gets up a couple times as long as everything at the evening witching hour goes well. But it's one of those situations where it's actually harder with the other two kids. You know this. You have multiple kids. Uh, the other two are more difficult than the baby because they are trying to figure out why mom and dad are so focused on little one, and it means you have to spend a lot more time being very intentional with your other two.
Yep, it's a
And
domino effect.
yeah. And I can't say that I was fully expecting the gravity of that. Like I knew it was going to be a thing. Everybody talks about you're not man on man, you're on zone defense now. Like everybody talks about that. But and knowing that I don't have the full understanding of what that means, I knew that, but it's just completely different than anything I was expecting.
Just wait till your kids figure out that you're playing zone defense.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. Then I'm toast.
Yep. Then they know that all they got to do is they got to spread the zone.
All right, you go in the kitchen. I'm going to go in the living room. Good luck, mom and dad.
Exactly. Little conspirators, I tell you.
It's true. And it becomes a thing now where our oldest is very particular about where she does certain things. Like she's okay hitting her sister. I'm not okay with that, obviously, but she doesn't do it when we're anywhere near. She makes sure that they're in a different room. And then Rose, our second, she'll come out crying, of course. It's like, okay, what happened? And you have to try to coerce it out of them because you didn't actually see anything. So you have a hard time disciplining them, not knowing what actually happened. Like, oh, well, the joys of parenting.
Exactly. See, now that you have more kids than there are adults, they'll just wait for the moments where you've got your back turned. And then those types of things happen more often. So it's a lot more figuring out what actually happened.
And yet people think that us humans are naturally good creatures. Right. And why do we have to teach ourselves to be good? Like, okay, if we were naturally good people, then why are our kids like this? Okay.
Exactly.
Get into this argument a lot. How's Mike doing? That's Joe. How's Mike?
Doing good. We had a week off at a Airbnb last week.
Oh, right.
Well, I guess this will be released quite a bit after we record this, but as we're recording this, I took a week off after Christmas, and my family and Rachel's whole extended family, so she's got a couple brothers and sisters who have families. We all rented this Airbnb, which sleeps 20 people, pretty comfortably, actually. Really nice place. The kids loved it because the cabin in the basement, the guy had finished off like his man cave, and he had a pinball machine and Golden Tee golf and Big Buck Hunter, bubble
Nice.
hockey, and their minds were blown that you could play all of these video games without actually putting in any quarters.
Nice.
So
That
yeah,
sounds like a blast.
it was good to get away, and I basically didn't do anything that whole week. I felt kind of guilty about it when I got back, but I think it was definitely needed.
And that whole taking breaks thing, we know it's a good thing, but we hate it.
Yep. So unproductive, it feels like, anyways.
It's true. True. You ready to jump into our follow-up here?
Let's do it.
All right. I'll go first here. I think we've got roughly the same number here, but the one thing I had on my list from last time is thinking out loud around my kids and at work about what can I do about this right now. So this goes back to the personal accountability piece, and owning owning the situation. It may not be my fault, but I'm going to own the situation. And that whole process of just thinking out loud, it's an interesting thing whenever something happens. Say I'm at the church working on an IT thing. We recently rolled out a new email structure, and I think I have one decent-sized issue. Other than that, it's all fairly straightforward. But in that particular situation, it looked kind of dire, and it was looking like it was going to be a nightmare. And I simply stopped and asked out loud, like, okay, well, this is a big problem, but what can we do about it right now? Because it looks like it's going to take a long time to fix it, but right now, what's the solution? I simply said that out loud, and the couple folks that were there immediately started helping on the brainstorming process on how to create like a workaround for this situation. And it turned out to be a pretty easy thing that ended up being the solution itself. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I had a couple of other folks that were asking about it later because it made the rounds. And it actually had a bigger impact than I thought it would, that people have started even questioning, well, this may be a bad situation, but what is it we can fix right now? So it's had an interesting trickle-down effect there. So I think that's something I want to continue to do because it's had a pretty big impact.
Cool.
The second one on this list, notice my blaming tendencies. Yeah, this is one I think I'm going to have to just continue following up on. I don't know that we'll do it here for a while, but I have realized that there are a lot of situations where something probably is my fault, but I don't want it to be. So I have a tendency to want to put it off on somebody else. That happens way more than I thought it did. And it's kind of humbling whenever you start trying to notice that. And it becomes something that it forces you to realize how often you don't take responsibility for a situation. So it's humbling, like I said, and something I should probably definitely keep up. Last one on my list, avoiding my phone in the early morning. Still terrible at this. Quite terrible at this. I think I succeeded one morning since we last talked, Mike. Once I have successfully pulled this off. And I was stressed most of the morning. I did not like it. Here we are.
So what specifically do you do on your phone in the early morning that you feel like you have to check certain things? Is there other tools or the ways that maybe you could get that information? Like, for example, one of the things that I use my phone for is checking the weather, but I could also do that using like the Amazon Echo that's in the kitchen. I don't physically have to have my phone with me then, and I can still get the information that I need.
Yeah, the things that I'm checking, and it's for a little bit different reason than others. There's a couple forums that I check, which sounds silly to check first thing in the morning, but the reason I'm checking those is I have released some free plugins and a couple, it's mostly free code that others are using, and I want to know if something's wrong with them. Like, that's part of it. So I'm trying to figure out if there's an issue with something I've done. That's the crux of most of my issue with the morning, because there's a couple email accounts I'll check. There are like I said, the forums, and I check in on GitHub for the coders and developers out there to see if there's any issues, that's a technical term, issues that have come up on that repository that tell me there's something wrong with the code. So it's mostly a quick rundown of, are all the programs and all the scripts and such that I've written, is everything still okay? Has anything broken? And I understand there's good reason not to check this first thing in the morning. Like, take, for example, I've got one for OmniFocus that updates when your next review is going to be. It's a fairly popular one, so it'll update your next review schedule for projects in OmniFocus. And there was an issue with it whenever we rolled over to the new year, and I knew there might be an issue with it, but I ran across it first thing in the morning. Now, I still haven't fixed it as we record this, but I'm aware of it, and I'm still trying to figure out how to solve that particular issue. Now, see, this is the negative side of it, Mike, because I found out about it early morning, not long after I got up, and then the rest of the morning I was trying to figure out how to solve it, even though I didn't have time to solve it. So I completely understand why I should not do this, and yet I continue to do it.
I'm not sure what to tell you there. I would probably do the same thing if I was in your shoes.
Oh,
Just
thanks.
being
That's
honest.
helpful.
Yeah, fortunately, I don't have to go online and check to make sure that the things that I've made haven't broken overnight. But I can definitely see that being an open loop that would cause a lot of stress. So I sympathize with you.
I think there's something deeper that I need to solve here, but I can't tell you what it is. I think it has something more to do with trusting what I've done and being okay with some of it being broken. Like, I think there's something there, but I haven't figured it out. And this is a long rant on, why I can't stop checking my phone in the morning. But it seems like there's something else involved that is caused around this mindset of not being willing to let go of something I've released and constantly wanting to fix and adjust the moment something goes wrong. I think there's something involved there. I just need to let it go and stop. Okay. All right. I'm going to be done with my rant on my phone in the morning. All right. I'm going to switch over. Let you go.
Yeah. So speaking of fixing things, one of my follow-up
I know. I saw that.
was no trying to fix anyone else. And I feel like I've done a pretty good job with this. I've caught myself a couple times just in my thought process, not actually gotten to the point where I've followed through with action and blaming people for certain things, but I've caught it internally where before I would default to something and say, you need to do this, catching it and applying it to myself first and saying, well, what can I do? Kind of going back to your first follow-up item, what can I do about this right now? And there have been a couple things that I've been able to do, and that has made things a lot smoother. One of those things is the next follow-up item, the reading the Strengths Finder with Rachel. I set her up with the account, sent her the login information, and she was going to do it while we were on the family vacation. That didn't actually happen, and so when we followed up in the family meeting on Sunday night, I was faced with a decision to either say, well, why didn't you do this, or hurry up and do it. But before I even was able to say that, there was an opportunity that I noticed, like, what can I do about this right now? I can create the space for Rachel to take this for the next 30 minutes. I can handle bedtime myself so that when she's done with this and I'm done with what we need to do getting the kids in bed, then we can talk about the results. That's obviously a much better solution than me saying, well, you had one thing you needed to do. so that was really interesting. And then also after we took after she took the Strengths Finder, we shared the results with each other, and we wrote down 5 things for each of us to apply based on the other person's results. So the Strengths Finder, the default results give you your top 5 strengths. And so, for example, one of the Rachel's top strength was empathy. And so I wrote down for my action item that based on the description there, which is surprisingly accurate. If you've taken these types of assessments, you read this and you get a really good idea. You understand a little bit more about yourself. And when you do it with your significant other, you understand a little bit more about them. So we read this description and she's like, yeah, that's exactly it. And one of the things that it talked about in there was that because her strength was empathy, she liked to contribute different viewpoints to decision-making processes, but she didn't like to be the one to actually make the decisions. I tend to be very black and white, and if I could manage all of my life inside of OmniFocus with every other person that I come in contact with, I probably would. But that's not the way that she's wired. So the takeaway there was that I need to lead the decision-making. I can't just delegate stuff to her and be like, okay, now you decide on this thing. Okay, I need to lead the decision-making, but I also need to ask Rachel what she thinks more often, not in a frame of mind as like, well, what do you think we should do? But what do you think about this particular situation or this particular problem? And so we each have 5 of those things based off of our strengths. And it was a really eye-opening experience to go through that.
Sounds like it's a very helpful thing to know. She likes to contribute to a decision, and then you like to make the decision. Because that, I feel like just knowing that can make that can have a huge impact on a marriage for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, going back to one of the other books that we talked about on this podcast, the willpower instinct, like every decision you make reduces the amount of willpower that you have available. So I was approaching this as, well, I'll handle these decisions, you handle those decisions. But that was actually creating more friction, and it ended up costing more in terms of the time, attention, focus, energy that we had to devote to this whole decision-making process. And so this is one of the adjustments that we've decided to make is, yeah, I'll lead the decision making, but I'm not going to do all the heavy lifting myself. I'm going to involve Rachel in the process. She's going to provide input so I don't have to expend as much myself. It's basically a different approach to the same type of problem. The problem is I can't physically handle making all of these decisions myself. We have to work as a team, but how we work as a team is influenced based on our strengths.
Nice. Well, it sounds like this has been a very helpful thing if you hadn't put it off for so long, Mike.
I know, right? Should have done this a long time ago.
What can I do about this right now? It's amazing how big that question can be. So last one on this follow-up list is 12-week year updates. For me, and the only reason I put this on here is because as we're recording this, it's the first of the year. And I know, if I remember correctly, Mike, you were talking about starting yours here at the beginning of the year. And the way my timing worked out, it meant that I finished up my first round a week ago, which means I had my week off last week, and then this is the beginning of another 12-week year for me. So following up to that, there's two different sets of this that I'm doing. One is for my personal and for my work. The other is for the church, because with the church and my role there, it kind of needs its own setup and needs to follow that as well. And since I started there about a month ago, it works out really well to kind of get my feet wet, and then I can kick off a 12-week year there and kind of run them in parallel. So for me, I've got my personal goals set, kicking those off here soon, and then I'm doing the same at the church. But I don't have a whole lot to report on it other than that. Other than I've got a buddy of mine over here in the Twin Cities area, Josh. I don't know. I need to give him grief. I don't know if he has a website of any kind. He should. He needs to change that. But he's a good friend of mine. But we're trying to do the whole accountability thing once a week on that, which actually, Mike, starts this afternoon. So that'll be kind of a fun add to my 12-week year process. But
Nice.
Am I right in thinking that you were planning to start this? Are you going to do that?
Yes, and I had intended to. This is one of the things that I intended to do over the week that I was on vacation, and of course
Worked out well, didn't it?
Didn't actually happen. I did do it personally. I meant to involve Rachel in the process, so I still need to do that at some point and do one for our family. But since this is the first time that we've ever done it, I just downloaded an Excel spreadsheet and followed the template and kind of filled it out based on my best guesses. And now in the next family meeting, my goal is to share that with Rachel and kind of get her feedback and tweak it based off of that. But it's a really interesting process. If you've never done it before, the first time, I don't know if you experienced this, but it was pretty difficult
Yeah,
to actually sit down and articulate all that stuff. You have these ideas for this big project that you want to do, and then to actually sit down and figure out the individual milestones that you can track on a weekly basis is a lot harder than just saying, yeah, I want to do this sometime.
I know. When I first put the first one together, when I did the initial one, it took me quite a while to figure out what are those goals, like what are the areas that I want to do these goals for, and how do I break them out week by week. And coming up with the goals is easy, I thought, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever it came to, okay, here's this week, and then here's this week, and then here's this week from start to end for each one of those goals, that was not easy. And even, I just redid it again. And even the second time, like coming up with the goals is fairly easy. I think I came up with what I wanted my goals to be in 10 minutes. And that was simple, but it's taken me a good 2 or 3 days of thinking it through to figure out what those milestones need to be. It's not simple. I understand, having gone through it, I know that it's powerful and it can be extremely helpful. And I got a lot done the last 3 months than I had, probably in the last 9 before that. But it just leads you to knowing what's coming up next, and that's what I want to pose at the church. I'm kind of curious to see how they're going to react to it. I've got a meeting this afternoon to talk through that. My the executive pastor that I report to, he's never heard of this that I'm aware of, so I'm planning. This will be fun. I'm planning to go into a conversation about 2017 goals and just talk about them, and then turn around and say, so my goal is to get all those done in the next 12 weeks. So I'm kind of curious to see how that pans out. But that should be a fun conversation.
Yeah, you'll have to let us know how that goes.
I know. It'll be entertaining, I'm sure. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. So you reading StrengthsFinder and then understanding yourself and your wife and knowing how the two of you work together to make decisions. I think that's a pretty good lead into your choice for our book today, because I think that what we're going to talk about the rest of this episode plays into that possibly perfectly.
Yeah, this is an interesting book. It's Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath, and basically the gist of it is that it's a framework for making better decisions. And I really don't have any rationale for picking this one other than I thought it looked really, really interesting.
Well, I'm really glad you picked it because I really enjoyed this one.
Nice. Yeah, it's different, and there's a ton of stories in here. The way that they implemented the stories, I thought was really great. It wasn't a bunch of random, person's first name like we read about in the powerful engagement, but they were carefully selected stories that illustrated the principles that they were talking about in real life situations, starting on page 6.
Yes. And he made the very simple demonstration here that if you walk into a courtroom, say you're on a trial, and the prosecutor at the trial presents PowerPoint slides, and using those PowerPoint slides, he demonstrates why the defendant is guilty, and then they're having to reach a decision based on that and that alone. Like, that would just be absurd. Like, that makes zero sense whatsoever. That's not the case at all. You have, no pun intended there, that's not how things work. But the idea is that you have to have all of this information to help make that decision, to draw it out and not be something that's just, here's what I think, and then making a decision based on what you think and feel. That is kind of the crux of the book, that there's more to making big decisions. And I say big decisions because there's a lot of little decisions you can kind of just run with, it sounds like. But if you use the courtroom analogy, there's no way that would ever fly. Like, that would just be a terrible and an absurd thing to do. So he takes us through this process of how to make better decisions.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how he starts by giving an example of a framework that a lot of people use, and the story that he uses to illustrate this shows that the guy ignored this framework, and it actually worked out better for him. So he talks about Benjamin Franklin's moral algebra, which is basically you make your list of pros and cons, and then you strike out the equally weighted items until you identify whether this decision has more pros or more cons. And Benjamin Franklin gave that advice to this guy who was trying to decide if he was going to go take this position with like an aristocrat in Europe somewhere. I forget the guy's name. I forget the exact situation. But according to the moral algebra, this guy should not have taken the position. He ends up taking the position, and it ends up being a great thing for him. But also the way that he did it is a little bit different too. One of the things that they talk a lot in this book about is that a lot of times we're tempted to think, should I do this or should I do that? And instead you should ask yourself, is there a way that I can do this and that? And so that's kind of what this guy did, is he spun it around a little bit and he tweaked the terms a little bit. And it wasn't so much I have to choose this path or that path sort of a decision. He was able to accomplish a lot of his goals, and it ended up being a great decision for everybody that was involved.
And it seemed like in that scenario that there were a lot of really good decisions he could have made. That was the part that struck me about that. There were a lot of options that he had that were all good options, and yet he somehow traversed all of this to create this awesome path using a bunch of them. So I thought it was interesting, and I'm with you. I can't recall his name. That's probably terrible, Mike. But It was an interesting story of how he kind of, and you don't really think of this as a good thing, he ignored Ben Franklin's advice
Yep.
and still came out for the better. To me, the idea of ignoring Ben Franklin makes zero sense whatsoever. But, hey, some people are probably smarter than Ben Franklin, and that seems crazy, but it's easily possible.
Well, I mean, he's definitely a very smart guy, but the real reason I think that it worked is that Ben Franklin didn't not have all of the information to accurately combat the villains of decision making that he talks about on page 9. And I know you put these in the show notes, but
Right.
this is one of the big things for me too, is that there's a couple different things that can influence us when we don't realize it, and it can cause us to make poor decisions. So number one, we kind of talked about already, that's the narrow framing, where you're only looking at these two options. And the solution to that is to widen your options. Second one is the confirmation bias. This one I thought was really interesting because I could totally see how this plays out in the business world, where you decide that you're going to do this thing, you're going to take advantage of this opportunity, and then you find all these facts to help support it.
I think this comes up a lot, and the part that struck me on this one is he had he mentioned that confirmation bias researchers struggle to overcome confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, so that means I'm toast, because if the people who study this and know it inside out can't beat it, how on earth am I expected to beat it? Like, this is not going to happen.
Right. Yep. And so the solution to that is to reality test your assumptions. The third villain of decision making is the short-term emotion. And this one, again, was really interesting because he's not saying in this book that you have to remove emotion from the equation. He talks a lot in the book about how emotion is actually a very important piece of decision making. But when you're making a decision instantly, those short-term emotions can influence you to make bad decisions. So the solution to that is to attain the distance before deciding. We've all heard the advice: sleep on it before you send that email. And then the last one is overconfidence. So once you've come to your decision, you're so sure that this is the right thing. And then the solution to that is prepare to be wrong. And he wraps all of these making better decision criteria. He has what's it called? An acronym, I believe, for this, called WRAP. So W, widen your options. R, reality test your assumptions. A, attain distance before deciding. 4, prepare to be wrong. And then at the end of the book, he even gives some case studies on how you can apply this WRAP process. After the majority of the book is about the individual steps of the WRAP process, but at the very end of the book, there's even some case studies where you can apply this to particular decisions. And I think this is a really, really solid framework. And if that's the only thing that you got out of reading this book, it was definitely worth it.
This is exactly why I told a couple people that I was having conversations with. I bring up books all the time with people anymore. It's probably really frustrating for others, but anyway. I talked to some folks who they're homeschooling their kids, and they are trying to figure out how to help their oldest 2 sons. One is a freshman, so he's a 9th grader, and the other one's an 11th grader. And they're starting to have these conversations about, what do you want to do as a career? Do you want to go to college? Like, they're trying to have all those conversations. I told them to read this book, both them and their kids, because to me, there's so many scenarios for especially students. I mean, think about it. You're getting ready to donate essentially 4 years of your time. If you say you're going to college, if you're going to donate 4 years of your time without an income in most cases, with the assumption that you're going into a career that you are going to excel at, how do you actually know that's the right decision to make? Wouldn't you be better off taking a month and donating your time to the industry before you donate 4 years? Like, simple things like that come out in this book. And it's one that I hope, would help a lot of students and a lot of parents help kids make those decisions.
Yeah, and even if you are confident that you want to go into a particular field, then typically it's how do I get into the best school? And he talks in here about how the U.S. News and World Report rankings that determine the highest rated schools, they're actually based on things that don't matter. Things like faculty compensation and the percentage of graduates who actually donate back to the university. They actually did independent research and found that when it comes to income, it really doesn't matter what school you go to. So I agree. It would be much better to figure out what is that thing, and maybe you do a small test before you actually dive in and decide that you want to devote 8 years of your life or more to becoming a doctor.
Right, and this comes from, so this is a part of the R in RAP, so I suppose RAP, WRAP. So the reality test your assumptions, that's essentially what I'm talking about there is, do a test to find out if this is the real thing you want to do. So they brought up Van Halen and the M&Ms again, which I thought was kind of fun. But that story seems to come up quite a bit because it seems absurd, it seems kind of diva-ish, and yet it's brilliant. And this is one where Van Halen he's doing the reality test in that case. He's making sure that everybody who's building the structures and taking care of all of his music equipment, that they're actually going to do what he can assume they need to do. So it's a reality test using something as simple as a brown M&M. Who'd have thought?
Yeah, and if you haven't listened, I think it was probably the previous episode we talked about this.
I think so, yeah.
But the gist of the story is that Van Halen, when they would go on tour, they would bring, I think they said in this book, 8 semis worth of gear.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So they were really the first ones to do these really, really technical productions when they would give a concert. And they knew that when they showed up to do the show, they couldn't check everything every time. So they used a clause in the contract where it said that there was to be a bowl of M&Ms backstage in the green room, and the brown M&Ms were to be removed. And if they went back there and they found brown M&Ms in the bowl, they actually, according to the contract, had the right to cancel the show and not refund any of the money. And the reason for this was basically a tripwire, which is another thing that he talks about in the book later on, where they knew that if they had overlooked that detail, then they probably overlooked a lot of other details when it came to setting up the 8 semis worth of gear. And that was basically their cue to have to go and check everything, because they knew that if they weren't going to pay attention to this one thing, there were some other things that probably slipped through the cracks too. And at one point, I believe they found a pretty major thing wrong, and it actually would have been life-threatening had they actually gone through with the show.
It's quite the deal. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but
it's not just M&Ms.
I know. It's more than an M&M. So I'm looking through our outline here, Mike, and I feel like we've kind of given a quick overview of the book, but I'm noticing that the remainder of the items that we have on this list are a bunch of tactics. So, we talk about RAP, widen your options, reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, and prepare to be wrong. The remainder that we're going to talk about here are some of the tactics and ways to help get the information and to make the decisions. I just want to clarify that because I feel like we've gone through a summary piece and we may hit some of these rapid fire because there's a bunch here.
Yep.
And there's a lot of really interesting and yet in some cases very small, like just ask a single question and it can really open things up. There's some of these that are very simple. Some of them are more complicated. Some of them are expensive that can help us make better decisions. Do you think it's fair if you're looking at the list that I'm looking at? I kind of wish I could share this with the listener.
Definitely. I completely agree. For example, the very first thing on here is the vanishing options test. And this applies to the first point of RAP, which is widen your options. And this is really, really simple, but it's something that a lot of people probably don't do. And I know that I've been guilty of this as well. The vanishing options test is basically if you can't do what you're considering right now, what other options are available to you? So this is really handy when you're trying to decide whether to take another job, for example, or stay in your current job. When you're looking at something like that, where there's 2 options, should I do this or should I not do this? If neither of those options are available to you, what other options are out there? So basically you eliminate the ones that are available to you, and then that helps you see all the other options that are actually available to you. You just haven't noticed it because you're so focused on this particular thing.
It makes a lot of sense, I think, if you come at it from the standpoint of here's what I can do right now and what happens if all those go away. And there are a lot of times I think whenever I look at like my business and there's some potential business partnerships that can come up, some new adventures. I suppose they could be adventures, business ventures that are possibilities for me. And it seems like I'm dealing with those quite a bit, and they come up quite a bit. Sometimes, honestly, a lot of them come from you, Mike. But these things come up, and I need to make a decision about them. And in a lot of cases, I try to make them very quickly. And if I were to, in some of these cases, just say, all right, if that's an option, but I need to do something, what would I do if those options weren't there? I haven't tried this in any scenario. Have you tried this at all?
Not recently. I don't think, at least explicitly, but I feel like I've kind of been asking myself this question for a long time because that was one of the tipping points when I was writing my book, which is called Thou Shalt Hustle. Kind of gives you an idea of the whole premise of the book. But I basically got to the point where I realized that a lot of times we were trying to decide between thing A or thing B, and we don't need to make that choice sometimes. Sometimes you can do both, and it's just figuring out how to do it. Sometimes it's neither. But the default should not just be, well, I have to pick one of these things. So I can look back at a couple different scenarios in my life, and I can identify different situations where I've kind of applied that, but not the way that they articulated it in this book.
So I should point out that this particular process falls under the widen your options part of making better decisions. So there's a few of them here we'll go through specifically on this, but another one of those ways to essentially get different ways, open up the possibilities for a decision, was simply asking, what about both? Like in so many cases, we have decisions that come up that are, should I do this or not? Well, sometimes you can ask, well, what if you do both? Or in some cases, like, okay, should I buy, buying something's probably not good because then I'm buying multiple. Should I buy a MacBook or an iPad? Both. But, sometimes you have decisions that come up, and rather than try to decide between them, you should ask the question of, can I do both of those? And does that open up new possibilities for me in the future?
I can tell you from personal experience that it definitely does when you take this approach. If I would have stuck with choose this or that, I never would have written the book, which never would have led to the position with Asian deficiency, never would have gotten connected with you most likely. Lots of other things that I've been able to do, lots of other opportunities that I've had don't happen if I have to make the choice between staying in the family business where I'm making pretty good money and I have security, and deciding that I'm going to just burn that bridge and become a writer because I had never written anything before. So, I mean, that's just a really obvious example of you don't have to choose between one or the other. You can actually do both. And I think that a lot of passion projects or side hustles or dreams that people have, they don't take action on them because they're waiting for the moment where it makes sense for them to chase that thing full time. But you don't have to do that right away. You can just make a little bit of movement in a particular direction. You can create a little bit of action, and then that can actually snowball as long as you're consistent with it. So what about both? I would argue that everybody should be looking for that option, not necessarily as the default for every decision that you make. If you do that, obviously you're going to get overcommitted and you're going to burn out. You need to maintain some sort of margin. But how many of those things are in people's hearts? How many goals do they have? How many books, that people want to write or businesses that they want to start? How many of those things don't happen because they're waiting for it to make sense to choose that option as opposed to the thing that they're right now committed to?
And one of the ways to think about this and to try to, I guess, avoid it is I keep saying he, it's they. So sorry guys, but they talk about the alarm that should set off in your mind whenever you hear somebody say, should I do this or that? Or I'm trying to decide whether or not to do something. The example he brought up was, I'm trying to decide whether or not to break up with my boyfriend. Like, they talked about that, and they also come at, should I buy this company or not? Well, that's not necessarily the right way to come at it, because it's limiting you down to essentially one option. Do this or not. Like, you're making one choice in that. And instead of coming at it and just saying there's this one option here, try to figure out what the assumption is. The assumption is, I need to decide about this particular scenario. And instead of trying to decide on that one scenario, you're better off trying to figure out if there's a different way to come at it. Like he talked about the example of buying, who was it? Quaker was buying Snapple.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the company layout there. They were simply trying to decide whether or not to buy it. Well, that would have been it ended up being a terrible thing. It ended up being a scenario where they probably should have thought about it of, is Snapple a good choice? Or should we save that money and invest it in research? Or should we look at buying a couple smaller companies that would potentially lead up to something like Snapple? Like, they didn't ask any of those questions. It was simply a, should we buy Snapple or not? And it stopped there. They didn't try to widen their choices. They simply stuck to the one and got laser focused on it, instead of trying to broaden the spotlight on what the options were in front of them. If you can kind of see that correlation there. But that's what you're trying to do, is if you see something that, a question that someone's asking, should I do this or not? Well, alarm bells should go off, because that means you're thinking in a narrow frame of mind, which is one of the villains of decision making.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting, the story about Frank and Doreen, because being married, your partner can be a very valuable resource when it comes to widening your options and realizing all of the options that are available to you. Basically, in this particular story, Doreen was stressed out at work and she just felt like she couldn't handle everything. So she was approaching this problem from a particular mindset, which is another thing that they bring up, the prevention focus versus the promotion focus. So if you have a significant other, there's a very good chance that one of you is prevention focused, one of you is promotion focused. Prevention focus basically orients you towards things that are negative. You want to avoid negative situations. Promotion focus is oriented towards positive outcomes. Well, wouldn't it be great if this actually happened? And so in this particular story, Doreen's all stressed out. She's looking for ways to reduce stress. She's thinking about quitting her job because she just can't handle the stress in that particular environment. Frank is looking at it through the lens of, how do you increase your happiness? So one of the solutions that he mentions is maybe you stop and you work out on the way home. And I think a lot of solutions to specific situations like that, where you're really stressed out and you're thinking about, I got to get out of this job. It's probably not wise to just burn that bridge, so to speak, or to just walk away from that particular situation. There's probably things that you can do in that particular situation to alleviate some stress in the corporate environment, for example, and there's some other things that you can do to increase your happiness. So in this particular story, what I took away was that I might be looking at the solution to this as one thing, my wife might be looking at the solution to this as another thing, and really the ideal situation is both. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's not so cut and dried as we have to pick one of these or the other.
I really like this story of Frank and Doreen. It was very, and this correlates throughout the rest of the book, Mike. At least I thought. A lot of these stories, they've got tons of them in this book to explain and illustrate these decisions that are being made and how they came about doing it. Like, these stories are very relatable. They're ones that you can easily grasp and you can easily comprehend, I guess. And it's something that illustrates their point very clearly. This is one of the reasons I had a hard time putting this book down, because it was very engaging, and I kept wanting to know. The stories would last 3 or 4 pages in some cases, and I would finish reading about the concept, and then I would read, because I was curious, I would read the first couple sentences of the story that was coming up, and then I was hooked, and I was another 4 pages in before I'd put it down. But then I got curious as to how that led to the next option and how, like, the next strategy that they were going to talk about. Like, oh gosh, this thing. All right, so here I am reading 30, 40, in one case 50 pages in a day because I'm just curious about it. This just kind of led me from one to the next. But that has a lot to do with the stories that are in it and just wanting to know how they apply the specific strategies that they're talking about.
Definitely. And they do a really good job of making the stories, I think you used the term relatable. That's a really good term. Like when I read the story about Doreen and Frank, I was picturing Mike and Rachel. Like I really
Nice.
could picture myself in those characters' shoes. And a lot of the stories are like that, even if they're about famous people. Even if you're not making a decision whether to spend $2 billion to acquire a company, the thought process that they go through and the way that they describe the characters makes them seem very real. And the processes that they use, you can totally see how you can apply those to your own specific situation. So another couple things under widening your options here are like multi-tracking, for example, which is the ability to consider more than one option at once. And then laddering up. This one I thought was really interesting. It's looking at other domains for solutions to your problem. So when you are looking at when you're trying to figure out a solution to a particular problem, first thing you'll probably do is you'll base it off of your own experience. Have I gone through this type of thing before? Do I know how to solve this? If you don't, then you might look at other people who are in that particular situation, the exact same situation that you are, and how they handled it. But laddering up is really even looking outside that into different domains. So maybe, for example, I forget the exact example they used in the book, but they were talking about Walmart and how they handled the queue lines for the checkouts and how that was more convenient or more efficient, and it got people through the lines faster. You can use that same sort of principle in a lot of different domains. You could use it in a theme park when you're designing the lines for the rides, for example, and just being able to recognize how people are applying these principles in different domains can really shed some light on some really valuable solutions, some really valuable options if you know where to look.
One of the stories that because with this book and with the stories, part of the reason it's so engaging is because you can sometimes learn how to do some things even beyond making decisions. Even though it's about making decisions, being decisive, you can still, through these examples, figure out new ways of doing certain things. And the one I want to call out here is Lexicon, the company, who, they're a genius at the multi-tracking thing you're talking about, of running with multiple scenarios all at one time in an effort to learn more about the situation and make an even better decision. And Lexicon, what the company does is they name products or companies. Like, that's what they do, is they name things. You know how hard it is to name things? Like, that is not
Yes.
a simple thing to do. And if you work online at all, you're naming things like constantly, it seems like. Clear down to writing article names. Like, yeah. So I thought it was interesting that they spell out their process for how they come up with names, which is multi-tracking to a T. Essentially what they do is they let some of their employees use the product itself. Say they're trying to name, I think the example they gave was naming one of Colgate's toothbrushes. It could be, like, it was a travel toothbrush. They were trying to get it named, so they let some of their employees use the product. Then a few of them came up with the concepts based on that experience. Like, it's easy, it's freshening, it's lightweight, it's simple to use. They would take some of those concepts and then let a different group of people who had no idea who the company or product was, they didn't have any idea what it was, they would take some of those concepts and then just try to come up with words or phrases that correlated with it. And they would do this over a period of time. And using that strategy of running with these multiple scenarios, they would have a group of people who were looking at all of the results that came in, and then they would try to draw correlations between them. And sometimes they would go back to a different group, and they would run with a different scenario, and they would run all these different systems all at one time until they came up with something very simple and that made perfect sense and that they could all agree on. And use the Colgate example. That's how they came up with the name for the Colgate Wisp, which I think is a fun name. But anyway, that's the process of Lexicon. And I bring that up because of two things. One, it shows the example of the multi-tracking, a way to widen your options even further. But also, that gave me a lot of ideas on how I can name things for myself in the future. Like, oh, these are some really good ways to name things. This would be awesome, and it won't cost me millions of dollars to hire a lexicon to do it.
Yeah, they also named, I believe, the Pentium line of processors for Intel, which was another thing
Right.
where they went outside the domain, and I forget exactly where they got that from, but they were looking at computer terms and nothing really fit. And then they ended up selecting Pentium, and their whole process for selecting these names, it's pretty amazing because they're so good at it. They're so efficient at it, and the results that they deliver time after time after time, it's pretty crazy that you can develop a creative system like that just continually produces those results just by learning a different way to think.
I really liked it. It was a fun set of examples because he used lexicon quite a bit in that process because it sounded like they were perfect at coming up with tons and tons of choices for themselves to pick from. So what we've been talking about here is the first part of RAP, the widen your options. Let's step into the second one there, the reality testing. What's the actual there? Reality test your assumptions. And he does this, they do this by, the first one that we have down here is asking yourself the question, a question. And say you have some different options on the table. You've got the options that you want to pick from. And then the next thing you would have to say is, what would have to be true in order to pick between those. And the story that they gave with this, at least the one that I can recall, because they had a few stories to correlate some of these, but they shared the story about I believe it was an oil company that had a mine, I guess, in Canada that was potentially going to be shut down because of a lot of different options. And they took the executive team, they took the management team, so the executive team making the big decision, and then the management team at the plant. And the two of them tried to figure out, do we shut this down or not? And of course, they're going to gridlock. The executives want to shut it down, and the managers don't because it employed over 1,000 people. So they don't want to shut it down. The whole economy in the area would probably fail if it was shut down. And that's a tough decision to make. It's not something you want to just, willy-nilly say, here you go. Like, you don't want to do that. But whenever they ask the question, what would have to be true for each one of these scenarios to be, what would have to be true to make each one of those a good decision? And by going through the process of defining in detail what would have to happen to make each one of those correct, and then trying out the process of coming up with those particular solutions, they were able to decide, yeah, this actually is a good decision to shut it down. Even the management team that didn't want to shut it down said, yes, we need to shut this down. But they would have never been on board with that if they hadn't gone through the process of reality testing the scenarios that they had to pick from.
Exactly. And also the reason that they're gridlocked in the first place was that they had different points of view, and those different points of view aren't necessarily bad. There's not always one right one and one wrong one, but they talk in the book about how we get locked into our own inside view a lot of times, and that's exactly what the managers did. They had this inside view. We can't let these people go. But when they were able to get an outside view, when they were able to reality test those assumptions, and they were able to project out, well, what happens, what has to be true in order for this to be the right choice, it was pretty obvious when they did that. So when it comes to decisions that we have to make, we have to be good at getting an outside view. And one example they gave of this, which I thought was kind of interesting, was Yelp. So you're going to go out to eat, you're in a new town, you're going to look, at least if you're like me, high fact finder on the Colby score, you're going to boot up Yelp, and you're going to see what are the places that have the highest reviews. And then you're going to base your decision on the outside view of the other people who have eaten there. And it's kind of silly when you think about it. Something like that, like where you're going to go eat, that's not really that big a decision. And we make those types of decisions the correct way a lot of times by getting those outside views. And he even says in there that sometimes there's criteria there that you're going to override the outside view because you want Mexican food, and there's a couple people who didn't like, they gave it bad reviews, but it was because it was too expensive, and you're flush with cash, your company's paying for it. You just want good Mexican food. In that case, you're going to ignore the outside views. But for the most part, we welcome the outside views when it comes to things like spending a couple bucks on a cup of coffee or buying an app on the App Store. But when it comes to the really big decisions, we don't seek those outside views. And he has a process that he talks about in there where we need to learn to zoom out, to learn from the experience of others, and then we need to zoom back in to our inside view in order to add the color. That's where a lot of the stories come, and you can see that that's how they did it in this book. They would zoom out, they talk about the whole decision-making framework, the RAP process, and they zoom in and they'd add all these stories to add color and life to what they were actually telling you.
One of the other ways to do the reality testing piece is what they were terming ooching. Have you heard this term before?
I've not, but I love this idea.
I do. I like it, but I'd never heard of ooching before. I think of myself as having grown up at least near the South, and supposedly this is a Southern term of ooching. Essentially, it kind of comes from scooching or, dipping your toe in the water, that scenario where, you're just going to ease into something a little bit. That's what he's getting at with ooching your way into something. Essentially what it is trying to find some way, however crude, to just test and see what the waters are like in a specific scenario. And they gave a few examples. I can't recall any of them off the top of my head at the moment, Mike. But effectively what you're doing is trying to take whatever your decision should be, you think it might be, and then find a way to try it out without going really big on it. I guess the example that I would go back to is when I was talking about the donating of 4 years of your time to go learn about a specific industry, like while you're in school, as opposed to taking a month to just donate your time to a specific business and learn about it and try it. Like that would be a way of ooching your way into something. Let's go try it for a month. It's a free month to the employer where I'm not going to make any money off of it, but it saves yourself 4 years of expensive school to go into an industry that you may not be good at or hate. But it's a way to test the waters before you get to it.
He also used the example of the hiring process, and I believe that, again, I said he, I meant they. One of them, I think it was...
That's the problem with co-authored books.
Right. But they tell the story, I think it was Dan who was involved in this hiring decision, and they had this guy who was applying for a graphic artist job, I believe, and did the interview and just absolutely did not like the guy, didn't click with him at all. And then they had, as part of the interview process, them submit samples of their work, and they didn't attach the names to the samples when they reviewed them. And this guy, the guy that the Dan didn't like, was the guy who performed the best by far. Everybody agreed that his work was the best. And so because they had him do that small test, the definition of ooch that they use in the book is to construct small experiments to test one's hypothesis. So by having him do that small test of that sample of work, they decided to hire this guy. And then actually after they hired him, found out that he's actually a really, really nice guy. And all of the reservations that Dan had about this guy before they hired him were completely off base. And they basically just talk about how interviews are pointless and little work samples like that are much better. One of the things that they wrote in there that I completely agree with, it just completely resonated with me and is something that I need to figure out how to apply this more in my life. But they said, why predict something we can test?
Yes.
Why take the chance that you're going to be completely wrong about something when you can validate it very, very simply?
Yes. So I go back to, mind blank. Cortex, CGP Grey. He was trying to hire someone to help do the animations for his videos. And part of his process to hire somebody was to have them submit work samples. That was the primary interview process, was to submit a sample of the work you can do and stop there. And if you're good at the work, why would I worry about some of the other stuff? Like, yeah, he's picky about can you work with me or not. You can figure some of that out, But the whole process was, let's do a preview. Let's do a sample of what this is going to look like and how it's going to work. Like, that's awesome. And so many times we run across an interview process that seems to make zero sense whatsoever. And asking questions, this goes back to the beginning. You wouldn't just sit and talk about the work you do. You wouldn't talk about why you think the defendant in a case is guilty. You wouldn't just talk about it. You would show evidence. You'd prove it. You'd give a preview of all the specifics that show that in reality. Like, that's what you want to do. Find a way to prove it. Like you're saying, why just assume something? Why talk about it when you could prove it? Why go off of concepts when you can have facts? Like, that makes zero sense whatsoever.
Exactly.
So the next step in RAP, so widen your options, reality test your assumptions, and then attain distance before deciding. So sleep on it. That's the real simple version is, take a night off. Get a little bit of distance from it, take some time. But one of the strategies that they give, page 160, if you're in the book, is using the 10-10-10 time frames, the framework there. And what that stands for is 10 minutes, 10 months, and 10 years. So a way to get distance on a decision is to ask yourself, how will I feel about this decision in 10 minutes? Okay, 10 minutes after I have decided to ask my boss for a raise, how am I going to feel about it? Possibly nervous about how he's going to do it, potentially really excited that you finally did that. In 10 months, how are you going to feel about that? Well, if it went well, you're going to be pretty excited about the raise that you got, or potentially thinking about asking again, or you may have turned out to be a very bad situation and you're not there anymore, but you might be at a better place overall. So there's a potential for quite a life-changing scenario, but in either case, you're better off. Or you could look at it in 10 years, in which case it's kind of a fun story. It probably was a keystone in your life, but it could still be a big part of that decision in 10 years out. So it's a way to, using this 10-10-10 time frames, to just kind of force yourself into getting some distance from a decision and just kind of looking at it from the future's standpoint. Did I explain that okay?
Yeah, you did a great job. And
Awesome.
This example is really what I think is so brilliant about this book. This is something that everybody knows. We know that we should not make decisions in the heat of the moment. We know that we should sleep on things. We know that we need to attain distance before we make these really important decisions, but we don't do it anyways. And what the 10-10-10 rule does is it gives you the support structure to fall back on. So instead of saying, well, I know I need to think about this some more, that's really vague. So there is no next step there. When do you define that you've thought about this enough in order to make this decision? And this gives you 3 very simple questions where once you ask these, the answers are very evident, and then you've got enough of a framework there to actually make a pretty good decision. How will you feel about this? Like, let's just say you're going to purchase something. How will you feel about this purchase in 10 minutes? Okay. If it's an impulse buy, you might still feel really good about it in 10 minutes. How will you feel about it in 10 months? You're probably getting sick of the thing. In 10 years from now, this is a complete waste of money. This is a really simple decision now that I've answered those 3 questions.
Yes.
At least if you have the long term in mind, if you're not just so focused on instant gratification. But I think deep down, people know that they need to think about the future. They just need a little bit of help. They need the training wheels to help keep them upright, keep them on the right track. And that's what the 10-10-10 rule does.
I'm trying to find the stats because I wanted to say exactly what they were, but I'm failing to find them at the moment. But he got to talking about the familiarity, like being familiar with something specific, and where is it? It was interesting to me because I'm going to get there, Mike. What he talked about in this particular scenario was media and how they use researchers and how we have a tendency to think that we're good at predicting things and think that we end up being overconfident with specific situations. And it has a lot to do with just we trust our own expertise and we think we're really good at predicting things. And they did some tests on experts, quote unquote experts, primarily who were in the media. And think of, we just went through the elections here in the US, and a lot of passion, a lot of emotions around that. And there are all kinds of experts that are offering advice and expertise on why they think things turned out the way they did. Why did the polls not figure this out? And essentially what happened was a researcher tested these experts and simply asked them to make predictions. And I think he collected, 2,000 plus? No, it was 80-some thousand predictions, and then ran results on them to figure out in 2 years' time were those predictions correct. And of the experts who were in the media talking about their predictions, it was like 70 to 80% wrong of the ones who were in the media. They were like 60% wrong on average, but if they were in the media in some form, it was closer to the 80%, which basically means if you're paying attention to, the news networks or anyone who's reporting any of this, if you have an expert that comes on to offer a prediction, you're better off assuming the opposite of whatever it is that they predict. Okay, well, maybe we should get some distance from this. Let's get away from some of these decisions that are being made here and that are being posed on us, because there's a good chance that they're wrong. And this is, I only bring this up because it to me is something that I'm pretty good about avoiding the news, because I know that most of it is extremely biased and you can't trust most of it. Maybe that's just my opinion, but I don't care for it. But I try to get myself some distance from that because of two things. One, I don't trust it. It's mostly negative, so I just don't feel the need to have that cluttering my mind. And two, if I'm going to make a decision about what I want to do for a business or what I'm going to do for my family or something, I don't want some of that affecting it. So in this case, I'm trying to get some space between me and that particular set of information, because to me, it's going to affect me negatively as opposed to positively. Is this making any sense? I'm trying to show the correlation here, but it's somewhat vague in my mind even.
Yeah, I mean, there was way too much to get everything that they wrote in this book, but to give a little bit more context to the statistic that you were trying to find, they mentioned the big takeaway was that like a teenager who doesn't know anything about this particular domain has a better chance of being right than an expert.
Yes.
Which is kind of shocking when you think about that.
There's another humbling fact.
Yeah. Another thing that influences decisions, another reason why we need to attain distance, is that we all have this loss aversion where we view losses as being more painful than gains are pleasant. So we'll tend to default to the things that we've always done, or the things that we already have. One example was they gave out coffee mugs, I believe, to 50 students who showed up for a lecture one day, and then they asked the students who got the mugs what they would value them at, or what they would sell it at, basically, and it was like $7 something. Then they asked the students who didn't get a mug, what would you be willing to pay to get that mug? And it was like $2. So there's obviously like a big difference there. And the equation that they share is that loss aversion plus mere exposure, the fact that we have this thing already, that combines to equal a status quo bias, where we'll just keep doing the things that we've always done and not stop to think about whether this really is the right decision. And attaining the distance, that helps us kind of balance these things a little bit better and overcome that loss aversion.
I think I run into this a lot with websites. Like, people don't want to change a website because they're afraid there's information on the website that they're going to lose. And I recently did one for a client where they were making some executive decisions to cut information off of the existing website as we were rebuilding it. And knowing that there are a handful of people that use that information, but also knowing that having it on there clutters it significantly, so that by cutting it, we make it cleaner and easier for the broader user base, even though there's going to be a little bit of a loss for a few. And depending on who you talk to, that was either a very good thing to do or an absolutely terrible thing to do. And a lot of it came down to, we have something in existence. We think it's working out well because we know how to use it. And I'm going to lose my familiar user. Like, I'm going to lose my knowledge of how this works. So I don't want to change it. How many times do we hear people say that they just want things to go back to the way they've always been? Why change? Like, don't change it if it ain't broke. Like, we see that a lot. I think this is why we're averse to losing something that we currently have for the sake of the broader goal. Like, instead of going for the bigger thing, we're stuck on this little thing that's going to keep us from getting to that.
Yeah, and it kind of leads into the final point, which is prepare to be wrong, because part of overcoming loss aversion is being proactive and choosing which things you're going to intentionally lose. Like, one of my takeaways from this book was to create a stop doing list. As soon as you create that stop doing list and you take control of the process and you are intentionally letting things go, you've overcome the loss aversion that naturally happens when somebody asks you, hey, can you do this particular thing? And you're already overcommitted. And instead of viewing it as, how do I do this? How do I squeeze this in? Well, I've got to let some things go. I don't want to let those things go because I've been doing them. I'm familiar with them. You get into that loss aversion, mere exposure, the status quo bias. If you intentionally create the margin, if you intentionally create that stop doing list, then you can acknowledge at the beginning of the process that there are some things that maybe I'm doing that are a little bit wrong. Maybe there are some adjustments that need to be made, some tweaks that need to be made to my particular situation, my particular system. And then when you do that, it opens up the door to the things that are actually better, the bigger opportunities.
And part of the process of just being ready to be wrong is setting what they call tripwires. So when you're making a decision, whether it's to do something or to not do something, you need to put things in place that trip you. I use that kind of figuratively. They are set there to remind you or to indicate that you need to stop and reconsider that decision. And there are a lot of instances where this happens, but in some cases it's like, okay, well, I need a new car, but now isn't the good time. But when I have, say, $6,000 in savings, that's when I'm going to reevaluate this. And that trip is to say, at that point, my current assumptions and my current decision is no longer valid, and I need to reevaluate it. At that point, my current decision is wrong, and I need to think over it again. And setting those tripwires can be, I guess, freeing, and they can help you to loosen up to make a decision. But it makes it a lot easier. I know we've done this in a few cases fairly recently, none of which I am comfortable talking about here, but they're good indicators to say, if I'm going to do this for my business, that would be great, but after 6 months, if I haven't received this amount of dollars, then I'm going to stop doing this. And setting those tripwires can be freeing to let you just run with a decision and know that when you get to a certain point, or if something does or doesn't happen, you need to stop and think it over again.
Yeah, it's designed to defeat the let's just see what happens mentality, and it refocuses you and it snaps you out of the autopilot that we can get stuck in. And they have a really great story of a tripwire here with the offer that Zappos has for their new recruits.
Oh, yeah.
Where basically they hire people, and very first thing, they take them through the training process. At the end of the training process, they say that if at any point you don't want to be here, walk up to any manager and say, I'd like to take the offer. And that is, Zappos will pay you $1,000 to leave.
That's kind of bold, isn't it?
It's really bold, but it makes so much sense from a business perspective, because Zappos they built their reputation on phenomenal customer service, and they told some pretty crazy stories about some of the customer service experiences in the book. But the real thing here is that those customer service experiences where you blow people's minds, that doesn't happen if you have people there that don't really want to be there, if they're just there to collect the paycheck. So this is genius, in my opinion, because you're going to naturally weed out all of those people. And how much money would those people, if they stayed on an extra 6 months, an extra 6 years and didn't perform at the level where they were supposed to be, a lot of times you don't even notice that as a manager. You can't really track that sort of thing very well. And so what is that really costing the organization or the business to have those people there who aren't putting everything into what they're doing?
One way that they talk about these tripwires was bookending. And it's kind of a way of saying there's two tripwires involved with the decision, one at the top and one at the bottom. And the example they give is that with an investor and deciding which stocks to invest in. And he uses a specific example of Redbox and the parent company that was involved with that, and how they were trying to make the decision as an investment group as to whether or not to put, in this case, millions of dollars into the company. And what they realized was if a lot of very dire situations happened, the stock price would be about $20 a share. If absolutely everything worked out for them and they had some home runs, it would be about $60 a share. And mathematically, if you get into stocks, there are some ways that you can calculate that based on some assumptions. Knowing that information, at the bottom, you would have one bookend at $20 a share. At the other end, you'd be bookended at $60 a share. And the current stock price for them was at 30, meaning you're at the lower end of that scale. And through watching the company and seeing how they were doing things, they realized that the company was doing things that the general public was not aware of, and that most investors were assuming was going to lead to a lot of trouble, which is why the stock seemed pretty low. And they felt like, as a group, that the company would be able to overcome some of those hurdles, knowing that they're towards the bottom of that scale, of that range from 20 to 60 at the 30. They decided to watch it for about another month and a half to 2 months, realized that it came down even further, and ended up investing in them because I think they averaged somewhere around $24 to $25 a share at millions of dollars into it. So you can imagine how many shares they bought there. Well, it turned out they were right. Things turned out for the better. The stock started to come back because, they felt like the worst that could happen here is we lose $5 or $6 per share. But they had the option to gain, $35 a share. Well, it came back to, at the end of it, I think it ended up around 48 is when they were starting to sell quite a bit because it was reaching the top of their scale, knowing that we're getting close. There's more to lose here than there is to win. Okay, let's get out. Well, they got out, and how many millions does that equal? A lot. So it turned out for the better for them. But essentially what that bookending process did for them was set tripwires on the top and bottom that allowed them to know when they could potentially be wrong in their decision. When we hit close to one of these two ends, that's when we're going to have issues. Now, Mike, I don't really know how to correlate this to my life and how to use this, but I think it's very interesting, the stocks thing, because I don't do single stocks, but it's something that I like paying attention to. I don't know that I would ever spend the time doing it because there's guys like this who can figure this stuff out and do it way better than I can, so I'm always going to lose. But that's something that I've always enjoyed watching it, but I don't know how to correlate it to what I do.
Well, I don't think that unless you're an investor, that the stocks example really hits home unless you dig a little bit deeper and you understand the process that they use, because there's two things that they use to identify the bookends that I think you can apply pretty generally, and that's the pre-mortem and the pre-parade. So we're probably all familiar with the post-mortem, where after, and it comes from the medical industry, where you kind of look back at why this person died, but you could also apply it to a project. What went wrong with this project? So that's the post-mortem, and that happens, that imagines the future death of a project, and it asks what killed it, basically. Pre-parade is similar to a pre-mortem, but it's assuming success instead of failure. So instead of looking back at the end of the project, identifying what went right, what went wrong, assuming at the very beginning what's the absolute best case scenario for this thing and what's the absolute worst case scenario for this thing, I think that you could use those to kind of frame the bookends whenever you're trying to make a decision. And this, again, is a great example of how in this book they explain things really, really I don't know what the term would be. It's very easy to apply this type of stuff. Like I'm not an investor, like you were saying. I don't relate to the stocks example, but I can definitely see instances where I could apply the pre-parade and the pre-mortem into the decisions that I'm making when it comes time to decide whether I'm going to pursue this particular project.
See, that makes a lot of sense. Knowing, if I pay attention to where the potential downfalls are, that could be a big thing. I get that. So we've been at this for a while. I'm looking at action items here. So just to summarize quick, the 4 villains to decision making, the things that trip us up: narrow framing, only looking at 1 or 2 options; confirmation bias, looking for information that confirms what I already want to do; short-term emotion, trying to make decisions in the moment instead of trying to get some distance from it; and overconfidence, placing too much weight on our own mentality and our own facts. And the way that you overcome each of those is to 1, widen your options; 2, reality test your assumptions; 3, attain distance before deciding; and 4, prepare to be wrong, using the acronym WRAP. There you go. So, all that said, action items, what do you do about it, Mike?
Well, let's start with you, because you have one here that says try to find 2 decisions to apply this to. So have you put any thought into this so far?
A little bit, yeah. And I haven't found exactly 2 that I want to. Well, maybe there's 1, but I have one in particular. So I've talked about Discourse before, the forum software that I contribute to as an open source project. I am in the process of potentially building a paid plugin for it. And I believe there's only one other paid plugin for it, and this one would be a direct competitor to that. I have a lot of reasons, my own mentality, and through confirmation from other people, that I feel like this would be a very good decision. So what I'm currently doing, so I guess I'm trying to decide on this, so I might apply this, is to ooch my way into it. I'm loving that term. I've been using it more and more, and everybody kind of looks at me funny. But I'm trying to figure out how to ooch my way into it and just try to do what do we call it? MVP, the minimally viable product. So do something very basic to get it out there and just try it. So I'm trying that process with it. So I guess that might be one decision that I'm trying to apply this process to. The other one is actually my other action item. So maybe I've got these 2. I'm still trying to play around with some other decisions where this might apply more directly, but I'm in the process also of deciding whether or not to build a what they call a CHMS. You familiar with these, Mike?
I'm not. I was going to ask you about that.
Okay. It's what they call a church management system. So if you're familiar with a CMS, content management system, this is kind of a play off of that. Effectively, what it is a way to manage all of the members of a congregation, keep track of volunteers in a church, to schedule them, and typically they also come with a check-in system for like a nursery. So there's a lot of safety and legal things that you have to be careful with something like a nursery, or it's similar to like a daycare. I guess it would be similar to that scenario if you're outside the church. That would be the correlation that you'd make there. But what I have found with my role as a director of IT at our church, I have learned that the one that we use, because our church is big enough that it's kind of hard to maintain all the volunteers primarily, it's less than ideal. that would be what I'd say. And in something I'm trying to do for them is make a decision on whether or not the one that we currently have is one we should stick with, or should we go to something different. So that's another decision I'm trying to use some of this framework for. But in my quick research for it, I have realized that there really aren't any really solid, good, modern choices for this. So I am considering building one, which is no small decision for my company. And it would require a lot of work and a lot of support, and potentially people helping me get it done from a management and a secretarial standpoint. So that's a pretty big choice that I'm needing to make. The problem I have here is that particular choice is a whether or not choice. So I need to See, I don't know if you caught it until I said that, but that's what it is. And that's, I have a lot to work through with some of these things. So what I'm planning to do is use this wrap process to help me through a few of these. I'll figure out a way to put this in for follow-up for the next time around, because some of this is very quickly moving for me. So some of it I'm trying to put off so I can get some more distance from it. And some of it I'm still trying to fact find on it. But there you go. So I'm trying to put this into effect immediately and have a bunch of big decisions I'm oddly trying to solve right now. Good timing.
Nice. And my action items are more of the small tactical items that they mentioned. So number 1, I mentioned already, create a stop doing list. Identify the things that I do not want to be doing anymore, and the things that the season has passed for that particular thing, and I need to cut it loose so that I can have more margin, so that when something else more valuable comes, I can say yes to it. Second one is to try out the productive interruptions. So the idea here is that you send yourself alerts. They recommend it on the hour, and basically you just ask yourself whether you are focused on what you should be focusing on right now. I'd like to think that I would be pretty good with this, but I want to get some data. I want to test this. So I'm gonna try this out, at least for a small period. It might drive me crazy after a little while, but I think at the beginning, at least, it'll give me a real clear picture of whether I'm actually investing my time the way I think I'm investing my time. Just simply answering the question, what are you doing right now? When that goes off every hour, I think might be enlightening.
What
but
is
it's also kind of scary.
Yeah, what's your tactical process for that? Are you gonna use the Apple Watch to do this? We're tech nerds. We have to ask these questions.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how I want to implement it yet. That's the thing. I will probably use the Do app, DUE, and just have it go off every hour between working hours. So maybe 8 to 5 or something like that. But I haven't really worked through 100% how I want to implement that yet, because I don't want it to just be annoying.
24 hours, ding every hour, go.
Maybe not.
What are you doing at 2 a.m.? Sleeping, go away.
And then the third one that I've got here is to use the active listening technique. They talk about this. They don't call it active listening in the book, but basically restating what others say so that they're confident that you're listening to them. And the way that they frame this in the book is they talk about procedural justice versus distributive justice. Procedural justice is where we believe that the procedures that were used to make decisions were just. Distributive justice is whether we think the spoils of a decision were divvied up fairly. So they used an example of 2 different cases, and one where the defendant loses the case, but they have confidence that the procedures were fair. They're actually happier with the outcome than the person who won the other case, but they're not confident that the procedures were fair. And so I think that this will just make everything a little bit smoother in interactions with other people, especially when it comes to group decision making. If I can show that I am actively listening and by restating what other people are saying so that they can be confident that I am hearing them correctly. I think regardless of the outcome, that has a lot of positive benefits. So I want to start doing that more.
What did you think of their writing style?
I really liked it. They jump around a lot in the chapters, but it's not as bad as some other books I've read. Like one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, which is a great book, but there's so many open loops throughout the individual chapters. He'll start one story, then he'll switch to another story, then he'll switch to another story, and then by the time you get to point number 4, he's back at the original story, and it's just like from one cutscene to the next. This one I thought flowed really well. It was really easy to follow. The writing style was really good. Like I mentioned earlier, the stories and the characters were very relatable. I saw a lot of different ways to implement what I was hearing or reading, And so I really like the author style, and jumping into the rating, I would give it a 5 stars.
Nice. So I already mentioned I had a hard time putting this one down. And from a recommendation standpoint, I I think this should be required reading for high school students. I do. This is something that would really help them with a lot of very big decisions that they're trying to make at that point, and put a framework in front of them on how to do that and to do it the right way. It's one that was very easy to jump into and just keep going. So I loved it. So I'm going to join you in the 5-star thing. So we've got a double up 5 here. And this is one that I think I can easily recommend to a very large group of people with zero hesitations. So if you're in school in any capacity, whether you're making a decision for college or what college to go to, any of those scenarios, this is one I think you should read before you make that decision. Easy.
Definitely. You tell us about the upcoming books?
Yep. So the next one up to transition here is my choice, called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. And the subtitle here is What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. So we read Brain Chains. This is kind of I'm going to guess, so I haven't read it yet. I'm going to guess it's something somewhat similar, but I'm hoping for one that's easier to recommend.
Right. I actually believe that Cal Newport references this book in Deep Work.
Yeah, I need to go figure out where I found this, because let's see if I can find it here, because I think this is one that was recommended in some other book that I don't know, Mike. I gotta go try to find it. Mentioned in The Productivity Project. That's where we got it.
Oh, right.
He was talking about the impact.
Sounded familiar.
Yeah, I was like, okay, this came up somewhere. This was not one that I just randomly found. It was one that I saw recommended elsewhere. So, yes, that would mean Chris Bailey is at fault here.
The one after that is my pick, and that is Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. I've heard about this book a lot, and I went and looked at the Amazon reviews for it, and they are very polarizing.
Nice.
There are a lot of people who absolutely love this book, and there are a lot of people who say this is absolute trash, but I can see why managers and CEOs love it. So I want to know what all the fuss is about.
So yeah, collecting information on things. Yeah, that's fun. Let's get something that's very polarizing. This will be a good experience. So if you're listening to this and you have a book that you want to get put into our list and you want to recommend it to us, you can do that out on bookworm.fm/recommend. Also out there, you can get the current list of books that we have completed, are planning to read, or that have been recommended in the past at same place, bookworm.fm/list.
And if you want to help us get the word out about Bookworm and help other people find the show, if you would take just a moment to go over to iTunes and leave a review, that would really help us out. We read all of those reviews, so any positive or negative feedback, we would love to hear what you have to think.
And if you're reading along, jump into The Shallows. That's coming up right now. And it'll be an interesting experience. We'll figure out what the internet's doing to our brains, and we'll go from there. But we'll jump into that one, and we'll talk to you next time.